There's two reasons that I can think of that potentially why Ukraine was so ready to take credit for an assassination. One is that Israel's been openly assassinating people for a long time, and this is not even military personnel that they've been assassinating. They've been
Right.
assassinating civilian leaders, political leaders.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
just this year we talked about Ismail Haniyeh
Right.
and Nasrallah and Beirut. While these people are actually engaged in, supposed ceasefire talks, negotiations,
Right.
they kill the civilian leadership. And it's met with a lot of applause and fanfare from the West and the U.S.
Right.
You see the Zionist side like, oh man, they're great. And then the pager attack as well that, detonated across the
Yeah.
Lebanon. And the supposedly Hezbollah personnel, but Hezbollah is also not just a military faction; it's a political one. These people run social services, healthcare services,
Right.
ambulance drivers. These were the people that were getting blown up. It's clearly an act of terrorism,
Yeah.
but it was deemed and celebrated like fantastic. So if you're Ukraine and you're watching this, it's like, well, apparently the West, the U.S., they love this type of stuff: decapitation strikes, assassinations, terrorism. It seems like it's all fine and dandy when Israel does it. So
Yeah.
why don't
No,
we
that's
do
a
it?
that's a very good point. I think that's completely true, and it kind of shows how, Israel's disregard for the laws of war, their genocide, and American complicity in that genocide and in those acts of terror have really are having consequences. Right? It's just that there are certain taboos that are now have ceased to exist. There's certain red lines that have been crossed, and so yeah, exactly. The Kiev regime looks at this and says, yeah, okay, obviously there aren't any consequences. They probably think neither from the Russians nor from our own allies. Now, I know that the U.S. government is still doesn't condone these acts openly. I think by and large, I think like just recently, maybe yesterday, the Pentagon said that it's not something they condoned. I can't remember the exact language that they used, but they did not approve of it, and then they claim not to know anything about it. And that's really an open question whether or not they knew something about it, or maybe were even involved. We don't know.
Right.
But the thing is, okay, so I think in general, Western governments have stopped at actually approving or condoning these assassinations. But there are a lot of, let's say, opinion leaders in these countries that have condoned them, have cheered them on. And as an example, I think it was in today's New York Times. I didn't read it, I just heard about it. There was an editorial that said it was a legitimate act of self-defense on the part of Ukraine. That was an editorial, so it wasn't even, the New York Times editors, but no, it was an editorial, right? So, yeah, I believe that's right. So it would be the New York Times editors. So that, that's a major part of the media establishment.
Right. It seems like what we're trying to do now is sort of blur the lines of morality, saying that this is okay, that these are actions that are done for the greater good. I was watching BBC just a little bit last night as well, and it was impressive just the spin on how this was a good thing that was done. They vilified this person, saying that he's a war criminal, General Igor Kirillov, using chemical weapons, and that there's now two wars that are being fought. That Ukraine isn't doing great in the conventional warfare, but they are winning the clandestine war. That they, in terms of espionage and terrorism, is what it is.
Right.
Espionage and assassination.
Right.
But they're trying to legitimize it as this is a legitimate front, a clandestine front. That this is how wars are supposed to be fought. Because we see that's what Israel does. And
I think what it comes down to, well, first of all, you should give yourself credit. This is something that you've been pointing to. You said that this is where they're going. They're going towards clandestine warfare, assassinations, terrorism. And,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
I was going.
And the BBC agrees with you, and the Ukrainians clearly do too. But yeah, let's see. What was I going to say? I'm sorry. It was we were.
Well, yeah. It is true. I mean, we called it. We said that the West is running out of options in Ukraine, so they're going to have to resort to more of this type of operations, and we're starting to see a little bit of this. But the other thing that I think that maybe why Ukraine did this and was so open and taking credit is they might be trying to goad Russia into response. It seems like that's the goal of everything. It seems like in this past month, the
Yeah.
decision to launch ATACMS, long range missiles into Russia. It didn't work in terms of any strategic accomplishments, but it seems like they did succeed in goading a bit of a response to escalate things further. And then
Um,
this, what do you think the goal of this assassination was? Was it to escalate?
yeah. Well, it may very well be. Okay, that's a possibility. I think sometimes, though, that we may make a mistake of just assuming rationality on the part of the Ukrainians. And I think that's often true of terrorism in general. Yeah, it has a stated purpose, and I think, and sometimes, and that at least partially explains lots of acts of terror by different actors around the world. Is to provoke an overreaction, and the overreaction is, um, you think, well, again, eventually lead to the downfall of your opponent. It's it's asymmetric warfare. Um, but then I think there's just some sort of nihilistic rage and hatred at work too, and the fact is that it hasn't succeeded in doing any of these. I think Putin is made it abundantly clear that he's not the kind of person that can be goaded into an overreaction. He's just not that person. And I think if they were really being very rational about it, they would recognize that. It's not working, and it won't work. I mean, Putin's just very, very cool and rational, and he'll know how to deal with this. That there might be some sort of retaliation, but he'll calibrate it very carefully to the point where it doesn't lead to any unnecessary complications, let's say, for the Russian military effort. The SMO will continue. But I think they're always there. I mean, how do you explain, for example, like the constant attacks on civilians in Donetsk and in other Russian regions? When an FPV drone is targeting a school bus and an ambulance, or artillery shells are fired at a kindergarten or whatever, is that what actually are they trying to achieve? I don't. That just doesn't make. That's just pure hatred. I think it's just an expression of the Banderist ideology, and a part of that, part of being a Banderite, of being an ultranationalist in Ukraine, is just hating Russians. That's part of your identity and wanting to kill them. And I know that's irrational, and it seems like a kind of an extreme statement, but I think, how do you explain this otherwise? And the thing is, you get statements from their leaders like that, like from Poroshenko talking about how the children in the Donbass will be cowering in their basements. So in other words, he understands what he's doing. He knows that his military is firing shells at schools and so forth. It's not just a few rogue elements. It's part of their policy, and it's just to kill Russians, and it's something that they find satisfaction in.
You're saying this was Poroshenko, so this is
Yeah, that was
earlier on,
Poroshenko, and then later
before
Budanov, and I'm sure you can find other statements, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just born out of desperation now, though. Desperation coupled with hatred.
Yeah.
Because
Well, they've
they're
been doing
not.
it all along. I mean, again, going
Yeah,
back
okay,
to
right.
right, because
2014, 2015.
yeah,
You know?
yeah. That time, I don't think they were desperate. It was just pure hatred.
Yeah. Oh, scary.
I guess one thing I wanted to add, I realized there was a point that I wanted to make, because we're talking about the West, and and how it's a little bit disturbing the extent to which Western leaders, maybe not the official statements by governments, but you just see increasingly, like from these media establishments that really speak for the Western elite, are approving of these acts of terror. I think it's just sort of part of a general transformation of morality. I mean, in the end, let's say if the Russians did the same thing, it would be proof of their evil, right? Because it's all instrumental. It's just, if this is directed against the Russians, it's good. I mean, otherwise, how do you explain a lot of what we're seeing? It's just that if it's okay to kill Russians, it's okay because they're the evil ones. It just becomes this new kind of Manichaean morality. Where I shouldn't, maybe
What
that's
is
not the correct one.
Manichaean morality? That's,
Yeah, that's actually not that's not actually the right. There are too many. Um, uh, yeah, it's not a good analogy. We'll just we won't talk about the mannequins here.
I have no idea
But
what
but
you're
it
talking
is a
about.
okay, yeah. But it's breaking the world, dividing the world into good and evil. With really hardly any shades of gray between. It's black and white, and you're the guys in the white hats, and they're the guys in the black hats. And so whatever you do against them is justified, right? Because they're evil. So you have to take off the gloves, and you just have to kill evil people. In the end, that takes you down a path where, let's say, wait a second, who is supposed to be evil? What makes somebody evil? But it's just, I've seen this over the course of the last 20 years. I think it became very apparent during the Iraq War. And you had people like Dick Cheney and saying, yeah, we need to take the gloves off. We have to do some things on the dark side. We just have to do this because we have to defeat evil. There are certain things that we supposedly should never do because of who we were, like torture. But then they said, well, now we have to indulge in torture because we must defeat evil. And this is something that I think has just progressed since then.
Right. And it's a very slippery slope. Once you pass that line, then it just starts to snowball, I believe, out of control.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very important to say that these certain acts are immoral, no matter what. Because once
Right.
you use the justification that, well, this is for the greater good, we will kill this person, assassinate this person to save more, then you can justify any type of preemptive strike, any type of assassination, and it will quickly become abused. I mean,
Right.
that's what we see Israel do with everything.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
this
So
is
they're
self
clearly
defense. This is self defense.
Right. They're clearly
You know.
contributing to this. Yeah.
Right. Instead of saying, well, no, it's immoral to drop a bomb and kill 50 innocent people to get one suspect.
Right.
That's an immoral act. But once you kind of
And-
throw
yeah,
that
and
out
again,
the
it has to be
window,
pointed out. I think it was back there, like in the early 2000s, 2003, that George W. Bush criticized the Israelis for killing too many civilians, and it was nothing like the ratios that we're seeing now. Maybe to rescue three Israeli soldiers, I can't remember, but it was like a 3-to-1 ratio rather than 100-to-1, which is the sort of thing we see now.
right. And I think this is something that's really going to kind of poison the soul of the West in many ways, is that we begin to, the media, our governments are trying to convince us that this is actually the moral position that we're taking, because there's a greater evil. So that justifies atrocity actions, that justifies terrorism, justifies assassinations. And I think it works to a large effect on people, because that's why I was saying we're blurring the lines of morality. These
Right.
people are like, well, this guy was a bad guy, right? We should be happy he's dead.
Yeah.
That's what the media told me.
Right.
And this is good. We got to get terrorists without any, it's just now it's immoral. But
Yeah.
we've convinced ourselves that it is moral, and that's a
Right.
big problem.
Right, right. Well, like right now, we're not being entirely open about what's going on. Actually, not by a long shot. So there's a lot of news that's suppressed. That the nearly daily attacks on civilians in eastern and southern Ukraine, and also in those provinces like Belgorod and Kursk and Bryansk, they just happen on pretty much on a daily basis. And they're obviously attacks on civilians. They're obviously acts of terror, and these just aren't reported at all. Or recently, a lot of news has come out about a massacre in Selidova. That was a town that the Russians recaptured back or captured, liberated about 2 months ago in the Donbass in Donetsk. And there's just not a peep from the West. There's not even something about, well, the Russians are claiming this. We don't know if this is true or whatever.
Wait, can you tell me what happened? You didn't really explain what happened.
Okay, yeah, there was a massacre. I've read some accounts of it. I can't remember what the exact numbers are. It may be 100, something like that. But entire families were just taken out of their houses and then, lined up and shot before the Ukrainians retreated from Selidova. They actually retreated quite hastily. And this is, we're getting story after story after story, right? You can say, okay, well, I mean, as a journalist, it's your duty to report this. You can point out that, okay, the Russians are making these claims. Maybe it isn't true, but you need to report it. The but they don't. All this information and the things about the attacks on civilians. Um, so much of that is just incontrovertible. I mean, again, we're talking about FPV drones, so they know what they're doing, and um, but in any case, these get suppressed. I mean, just entirely suppressed. So the average consumer of news in the West has no idea what's going on. But the fact that they're suppressing it already shows complicity. It sort of shows that there's an awareness, hey, this looks bad. Maybe this is even bad, but we need to suppress it. But the more you suppress it, the more complicit you become in that evil. It's the same thing actually in Israel that, okay, a lot of these, like the assassinations of the leaders and the and the pager attacks and so on. Of course, that made it into the news. You can't hide it, and it was in fact celebrated. But the attacks on kids, hey, that still looks bad, right? So we just don't talk about it. But when you do that, or you greatly suppress them, it shows that you are complicit. That to some extent you support it. If you don't, you as a journalist, your job is to report what happens, and you choose not to, you have actually made a moral, decision that somehow that this kind of evil is acceptable, and that's what we're seeing happen.
That's what we've become. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I didn't even hear about this in Salutable, and I'm much more plugged in than the average American news consumer. So it just shows you how suppressed these things are. But it also goes to show, within Ukraine, a lot of the attacks on civilians, atrocities that Ukrainians commit is suppressed. And I think one of the reasons, or is hidden from view, and I think one of the reasons it's hidden from view is juxtaposed against what Israel's doing. It just sort of shadows in comparison, and it's hard to you can't hide what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon because they're just these giant bombs being dropped on residential buildings, and
right. Or just one picture of northern Gaza. You see, there's nothing left standing. They've actually destroyed everything. Right.
Right. Yeah. No. It's we are a new, we kind of talked about it, that this is kind of becoming the new face of the American empire control and part of it is that we have to use that clandestine tentacle, as you called them, right? That this is our way to control. We have to subvert through.
But in a way, it's also it is a sign of weakness. I mean, because it's not going to succeed. It's not going to defeat the Russians. It's simply going to anger them and strengthen their resolve. So it's
I think the rest of the world also is looking at the West and said these guys have no morality left, right? Like how do South America and the Asian countries and African countries, they probably look at this and they probably draw the same conclusions as well. Like, this is immoral, right? These guys. This is the immoral group that is now engaging openly in acts of terrorism and bragging about it.
Right. Yeah. No. Amongst certain people, including supporters of Russia, I often say like the failure of the Russians to retaliate against these acts of terror is a mistake. They think it shows weakness. It shows that Putin is too soft. But first of all, I think that's something wrong. We don't. Again. If the other side, commits atrocities or acts of terror, we don't do the same. We're fighting. We don't go down that road. We stay on this. We don't go into the darkness or do things on the dark side, the way that Dick Cheney said, the way he put it, and that actually, that's not the purpose isn't to win friends, but it does win friends. The thing is that the rest of the world does see this, and it brings them over to the Russian side, and I think that's happened over the course of these last nearly 3 years. There was a lot of kind of a shock when it first when the war broke out, and there was a lot of and in general there's the Russians were very much in the minority. They most of the world condemned the SMO, but that's really changed over time, and that is, I think, is because of the way the Russians have conducted the war. So no, Putin knows what he's doing. I mean, he's right to do it, and in this case, being ethical and showing restraint is not a sign of weakness. In a way, it's a sign of strength. It really is. He knows that he's winning this war, and he will.